but I wanted to know, like, who were the Boers? Because they have an extremely wild history is the only way I could say it. Like, South African history is more comparative to the United States history than I ever realized. Like, the Boers are very much like, they remind you of like the early American settlers. But we have a third host on. Why don't we get the opinion of our third host, Reginald?
Ah, finally, my moment. The Dutch, bless their soggy little tulip gardens, are a nation of cheese merchants and windmill whisperers who somehow stumbled their way into an empire. And the Boers. Imagine taking the worst bits of Dutch stubbornness, plonking them in the middle of nowhere, and adding a dollop of Calvinist self-righteousness. Presto, you've got a people who can argue with a rock and lose. Frankly, the Dutch were better off sticking to clogs and canals instead of mucking about in Africa and Asia, pretending they were conquerors. And as for the Boers, well, their greatest achievement was managing to make the British look magnanimous by comparison. Truly remarkable.
Okay. Well, you heard it here.
Well said, Reginald. Jesus, that was harsh.
Scathing review.
The way that I was going to take this episode is how cool the Boers were, but I guess they were kind of racist, all those things. But who wasn't back then? But
I thought that Reginald was so woke.
Yeah. Well, let's take this back. So the Boer, like, who are the Boers? So in order to tell this story or who they are, you need to go back into Dutch history. You need to go back into European history in the 17th century. So I'll start with like the dramatic story. So in March of 1647, the Dutch East India Company, they were returning home from the East Indies, and while rounding the Cape of Good Hope, they encountered this massive storm and it wrecked their ship, and they ended up in Table Bay, which is now present-day Cape Town, South Africa. Now, everyone survives this shipwreck, and then a couple of them were also rescued, but 62 of the crew members were asked to stay behind, and they had to salvage as much cargo as possible. So what they had to do is they had to live in Turtle Bay. They had to live in South Africa for a year until VOC ships, so Dutch East India Company, VOC, until they would arrive on their annual voyages. Because this is not a trip that was easy, going around Europe and then going around the tip of South Africa, going to the other, voyaging to Asia. It was a harsh trip. So they had to wait a full year for them to get picked up. Now, this meant that they had to live off the land, and what they had in their ships wasn't really enough to survive for that year. So what these sailors did is that they had to build relationships with the local tribes. So the Khoikhoi were the dominant tribe of that time. And the Khoikhoi, the tribes of South Africa in those times, when they encountered Europeans, they were often violent. Or maybe it was the other way around, but there would be clashes between Europeans and the native tribes in South Africa.
Sure.
So much so that the Portuguese were there first. They made those trips first. The Portuguese believed that these native tribes in the Cape, they made it just inhospitable for a permanent settlement. So they never really established their grounds there. And the Khoikhoi, it sounds funny. The Khoikhoi, they're an interesting tribe as well, because Africa is a diverse continent. People are genetically different everywhere, within every region. I think more so than any other continent. Africans have probably the most genetic diversity. And the Khoikhoi, the way that they're actually described by the Portuguese is that they're not even black, that they're like, more Asian look, like Asiatic looking, and that they just overall look different than other blacks that they've encountered. And these were if you look at the descendant tribes of the Khoikhoi now, you can find them on YouTube. They actually spoke. You know how in South Park there was the Starvin' Marvin episode?
Yeah.
where everyone's spoken gluck, 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 gluck.
Yep.
This is how they actually spoke. This was their language. So they
Well,
spoke.
there's still languages in South Africa, like Xhosa, which is a clicking language.
Yeah, well, this is where they spoke in the clicking language.
I see.
They spoke the click, click, gluck, 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 gluck.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's pretty common actually right now. So, yeah, makes sense. They still speak Xhosa right now. So,
Yeah, but that's mostly just like in those tribes, like not in the cities. They don't. They're the blacks who live in like Cape Town or not don't speak that. But this tribe was a speaker of that. They weren't a Bantu speaking tribe, which the Bantu speakers are further up north.
Got it.
So the Khoikhoi kind of developed this reputation among the Europeans as like these non-primitive. They're not as primitive as the other Africans, because they were actually more. They were herders. That was their main thing. So they managed cattle. They weren't hunters and gatherers. So given the circumstances, the Dutch they're forced to cooperate with them and trade for food. And over the following year, these sailors come to the conclusion that this is actually a nice place. This is a good place to establish a settlement. As long as you can get along with the local tribes, what the tribes will do is that they'll barter their livestock for European goods.
Mm-hmm.
So they built these networks there, and South Africa has a good climate. There's areas that have fertile land. There's plenty of game to hunt as well. These guys when they were there, if you read the reports, man, they were like shooting rhinos and stuff. So they were like hunting big game. Just imagine that being some Dutch sailor. You're on your way back and you're in Africa and you encounter a rhinoceros.
Fucking rhino. Yeah.
Without any context. Like what?
Dude, Africa has the most megafauna on the planet. Like it's just most of those animals are fucking scary. But if you're brave enough and you want to shoot one, you're gonna eat good. So.
Oh yeah. Or you can take a nice picture. It's funny that trophy hunting, people are, I would never have the inclination to go to Africa and shoot like elephants are outlawed, but like shoot like a lion or something like that.
I wouldn't shoot any animal,
I would never want to do that. But those guys, they're huge money makers for those economies.
Yeah.
And they're big conservationists too. Like they drop money kind of preserving those lands because they want those animals to shoot, which is
I think there was a lot of like South African, not literally South Africa, but South of Africa nations that were having like food shortages during COVID and post COVID, and they opened up like game hunting of like zebra and like rhino and shit like that.
Oh, really?
Because they literally had to eat. They couldn't eat because of the supply chain issues and other issues as well, like drought and other shit like that too. But yeah, that was super recently actually.
Imagine how terrible zebra tastes.
I can't imagine. It's probably really gamey.
It's probably gross. So I would want to try it though. So all right, going back to the story. So all right, these guys, they realize this is a good spot, and they go back to the Netherlands and they write a report to the company. And they basically make the argument that the Cape of Good Hope should become a permanent settlement. And this would be a perfect stopping point, because a VOC ship, it took roughly 7 to 8 months for them to sail from Amsterdam to the East Indies, which was, their main colonial hub. They had other resupply stations throughout, off the coast of Africa, and they had one in Mozambique, they had one in St. Helena, but these station points, they would take them off course on the trip. And also, they were also just like not in strategic areas before you were making like long voyages. Like imagine not stopping until you hit Mozambique.
Right.
So they wanted a place where you can, the Cape was actually like the direct like middle point between the East Indies and the Netherlands. So they,
you don't have to go very far off course either.
Yeah.
Because if you want to go to Mozambique, you got to like hook back north to get there. And then you're going to have to come back down south. So it's like adding extra miles to the trip for no good reason.
Yeah.